The Boston Museum of Science auditorium was absolutely packed that Tuesday evening. Every seat was filled with people who looked like they spent most of their time buried in textbooks and research papers. Professors with gray hair and thick glasses, graduate students clutching notebooks, scientists in wrinkled button-down shirts. This wasn't the kind of crowd you'd normally find at a museum on a weeknight, but tonight was special. Tonight, one of Harvard's most respected professors was giving a talk about mathematics that even other mathematicians couldn't solve. 12-year-old Priya sat wedged between her father and her older brother in the very last row. Her legs barely touched the floor and she had to crane her neck to see over the tall man sitting in front of her. Most kids her age were probably at home right now, maybe doing homework or playing video games or scrolling through their phones. But Priya had begged her dad for weeks to bring her to this symposium. The poster had said something about impossible mathematical problems, and that was all she needed to hear. To Priya, impossible problems weren't scary. They were irresistible. Her father, Raj, worked as a software engineer at a tech company downtown. He'd tried to warn her that this might be boring. "It's going to be very technical, sweetheart," he'd said. "Even I might not understand half of it." But Priya had given him that look, the one she'd been perfecting since she was 5 years old. The one that said she wasn't going to let this go. So here they were on a school night, surrounded by people with PhD certificates hanging on their office walls. Up on stage, Professor Richard Thornton adjusted the microphone and clicked to his first slide. He was exactly what you'd picture when someone said Harvard professor. Salt and pepper hair neatly combed. Expensive suit that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. The kind of confident posture that came from decades of being the smartest person in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone of someone who was used to people hanging on his every word. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight," he began, and the room fell into respectful silence. "I want to talk to you about something that has fascinated and frustrated mathematicians for generations. Something that, despite our best efforts and our most powerful computers, remains beyond our reach." Priya leaned forward in her seat. Her notebook was already open on her lap, pen ready. Professor Thornton's next slide showed what looked like complete chaos to most people. Rows and rows of numbers, symbols, and equations that seemed to go on forever. "This," he said, pointing at the screen with a small remote, "is what we call a prime number sequencing problem." Now, for those not familiar, prime numbers are the building blocks of all mathematics. They're numbers that can only be divided by 1 in themselves. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on. Simple concept, right? A few people in the audience nodded. Priya was already 3 steps ahead, her mind racing through the implications. "But here's where it gets interesting," the professor continued. "We've been trying to find a pattern in how these prime numbers appear. A way to predict them. A formula that could help us understand their distribution across infinity. And this particular problem," he gestured at the screen again, "has stumped everyone who's tried to solve it. We're talking about some of the brightest mathematical minds in the world, people who've dedicated their entire careers to this single question." He clicked to the next slide, which showed even more complex equations. Someone in the third row actually gasped. Priya's brother Dev whispered to their father, "Do you understand any of this?" Raj just shook his head and smiled. But Priya understood more than anyone knew. For the past 2 years, ever since her third-grade teacher had mentioned that prime numbers were like the atoms of mathematics, she'd been obsessed. While other kids collected Pokemon cards or followed their favorite influencers, Priya collected prime number patterns. She'd filled notebook after notebook with sequences, looking for connections that everyone said didn't exist. Professor Thornton walked across the stage, his voice growing more emphatic. "We've thrown supercomputers at this problem. Machines that can perform billions of calculations per second. And you know what? They can't crack it. The computational power required is simply beyond what we currently have available. We're talking about resources that won't exist for another 20, maybe 30 years." He paused for effect, looking out over his audience. "And even if we had those computers, we'd still need a fundamentally different approach to number theory. A completely revolutionary way of thinking about the problem itself. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm telling you tonight is this. With our current understanding of mathematics, this problem is impossible to solve." The word impossible seemed to echo through the auditorium. Several professors nodded solemnly, as if attending a funeral for a dream that had died long ago. But in the back row, something stirred in Priya's chest. That word didn't scare her. It never had. When teachers said something was impossible, she heard it as a challenge. When textbooks said, "This concept is too advanced," she stayed up late figuring it out anyway. Professor Thornton continued his presentation, going deeper into the technical aspects of why this problem couldn't be solved. He talked about algorithmic complexity and computational limitations. He showed graphs and charts that proved his point. Every few minutes he'd circle back to that same conclusion. Impossible, impossible, impossible. Priya barely heard the last half of his talk. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, racing through an idea that had been forming in her head for months. She'd been working on something in her bedroom, mapping prime numbers on her wall with colored string and pushpins until it looked like a detective's conspiracy board. Her mother had asked her to take it down twice, worried that guests would think they were crazy. But there was a pattern there. Priya had seen it, or at least she thought she had. When Professor Thornton finished his presentation, he opened the floor for questions. "I'm happy to answer any questions you might have," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "Though I warn you, I've just spent 45 minutes explaining why this can't be solved. So if anyone thinks they've found a solution, I'd love to hear it." He said it with a smile. But there was something in his tone that made it clear he wasn't expecting anyone to challenge him. This was a rhetorical invitation, the kind professors made when they were confident no one would actually take them up on it. That's when Priya's hand went up. At first, no one noticed. She was so far back and so small that her raised hand barely cleared the heads of the people in front of her. But she kept it up there, steady and determined. Her father noticed and looked at her with concern. "Priya," he whispered, "what are you doing?" "I have a question," she whispered back. "Honey, maybe wait until—" But it was too late. One of the people in the middle section had turned around, probably stretching their neck after sitting so long, and had spotted her raised hand. They tapped the person next to them and pointed. Then that person turned. Like a wave moving through the crowd, more and more people looked back to see what everyone was looking at. A few of them smiled when they saw it was a kid. The kind of indulgent smile adults give when a child says something cute but obviously wrong. Some probably assumed she'd wandered into the wrong event. Maybe she thought this was a planetarium show or something more kid-friendly. Professor Thornton, standing on the stage and squinting past the bright lights, finally noticed the commotion in the back. He raised his hand to shield his eyes and peered into the audience. "Yes, I think I see a hand back there." Priya stood up. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Dev grabbed her arm, hissing, "What are you doing?" "Sit down!" But she gently pulled away from him. The entire auditorium was looking at her now. Hundreds of eyes. Some curious. Some amused. Some already dismissive. But Priya had learned something important in her 12 years. The moment before you speak is always the scariest. Once you start talking, once you share what you know, the fear goes away and all that's left is the truth. She took a breath and spoke, her voice carrying clearer than she expected in the suddenly silent room. Professor Thornton pointed toward the back of the auditorium, his hand shielding his eyes from the stage lights. "Yes, you in the back row. Go ahead with your question." Priya's voice came out steadier than she felt inside. "Professor Thornton, what if you approached the prime sequence problem using modular arithmetic combined with recursive pattern recognition? Instead of calculating every possible combination, you could eliminate whole branches by identifying self-similar structures in how the sequences distribute themselves." The silence that followed was the kind you could almost touch. It wasn't the polite quiet of people listening. It was the shocked stillness of people trying to process what they'd just heard. The woman sitting 2 rows ahead of Priya turned completely around in her seat, her mouth slightly open. A man with a gray beard leaned over to his colleague and whispered something urgent. Professor Thornton's confident expression flickered. His eyebrows drew together. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?" Raj put his hand on Priya's shoulder. She could feel him trembling slightly, though whether it was from pride or nervousness, she couldn't tell. Her brother had his face in his hands, probably dying of second-hand embarrassment. But Priya had started this, and she wasn't going to back down now. She spoke again, more clearly this time, trying to project her voice the way her drama teacher had taught her. "I said, what if instead of treating this as a brute force calculation problem, you mapped the prime sequences into a 3-dimensional matrix? When you do that, instead of looking at them in a straight line, patterns start to emerge, patterns that could dramatically reduce how much computing power you'd actually need. You could have heard a pin drop. Somewhere in the middle section, someone's phone buzzed, and it sounded as loud as a fire alarm in the silence. Professor Thornton's face went through several expressions in quick succession. First confusion, then something that looked almost like annoyance, then a sort of patronizing concern. He glanced at the moderator sitting in the front row, a woman with short red hair who looked just as surprised as everyone else. When he looked back at Priya, he had arranged his features into what was probably meant to be a kind smile. That's quite an interesting thought experiment, young lady," he said. The auditorium speakers carried every nuance of his tone, and there was no mistaking the condescension in it. Not mean exactly, but the way you might speak to a child who insisted they could fly if they just flapped their arms hard enough. But I can assure you, some of the greatest mathematical minds in the world have explored every conceivable approach to this problem. Every angle, every framework, every possible methodology. He walked a few steps across the stage, warming to his explanation now. The computational complexity alone of what you're suggesting makes it, well, let me put it this way, it's simply not feasible. We're not talking about a simple programming challenge here. We're talking about fundamental limitations in how we understand number theory itself. A few people in the audience were nodding along with him. Of course, the Harvard professor was right. Of course, the child was mistaken. It was the natural order of things. But Priya didn't sit down. She reached into her backpack, the old canvas one covered in pins and patches, and pulled out a notebook. It wasn't anything fancy, just a plain composition notebook with a black and white cover, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $2. But it was thick, stuffed with papers and sticky notes, the edges worn from constant use. "What if I could show you?" Priya asked. The murmuring started immediately. People leaned toward each other, whispering, "Is she serious? This is awkward. Someone should really," but no one finished their sentences because everyone was too busy watching to see what would happen next. Professor Thornton's diplomatic smile tightened just a fraction. He was in an impossible position, and he knew it. If he shut down a child publicly, especially in front of all these people and the museum staff recording this for their website, he'd look like a bully. Universities cared a lot about their public image these days. But if he let this continue, he was giving legitimacy to what he assumed was going to be an embarrassing waste of everyone's time. He looked at his watch, then at the moderator again, searching for a graceful exit. The moderator just shrugged slightly as if to say, "Your call." Finally, Professor Thornton made his decision. He spread his hands in a gesture that looked generous but felt calculated. "Tell you what," he said, and his tone was almost playful now, like they were all in on a joke together. "If you really think you have something to show us, why don't you come up here to the stage? But I have to warn you," he gestured at the audience, "this is a room full of experts, people who've spent years, even decades, studying these problems." It was a power move disguised as kindness. He was giving her enough rope to hang herself, as the saying went. Let the kid come up, show whatever cute little project she'd put together. Everyone would applaud politely, and then they could get back to serious academic discussion. Maybe afterward he'd even have a kind word with her parents about encouraging her interest while making sure she understood the difference between enthusiasm and actual breakthrough research. Priya closed her notebook and held it against her chest. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. It was adrenaline, pure and simple. She'd spent 2 years on this. 2 years of late nights and early mornings. 2 years of her mother calling upstairs, "Priya, are you still awake?" while she huddled under her covers with a flashlight, scribbling equations. 2 years of her teachers saying, "That's very advanced. Maybe you should focus on your regular homework." 2 years of people telling her in various gentle ways that she was too young to understand what she was trying to do, and now she had a chance to prove them all wrong. "Okay," she said simply. The walk down the aisle toward the stage felt like it took forever. Every step echoed in the quiet auditorium. People twisted in their seats to watch her pass. She heard whispers following her like a wave. "How old is she? Is this part of the program? Poor kid, this is going to be painful to watch." Dev hissed from behind her. "Priya, you don't have to do this." But she kept walking. Her father stood up, looking torn between stopping her and supporting her. In the end, he just watched, his engineer's mind probably running through every possible outcome of what was about to happen. When Priya reached the front of the auditorium, She had to climb 3 steps to get onto the stage. They were built for adult legs, and she had to use the handrail to pull herself up. Someone in the audience actually awed the way people do when they see something cute. It made Priya's jaw tighten with determination. Up on the stage, with the bright lights in her eyes and hundreds of people staring at her, she felt smaller than ever. Professor Thornton stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression neutral but his body language screaming skepticism. The massive screen behind them still showed his equations, complicated and intimidating and supposedly unsolvable. Next to the podium was a laptop, connected to the projector that had been displaying the professor's presentation. It sat there like a challenge, its screen dark and waiting. Professor Thornton gestured toward it with exaggerated courtesy, the way a maitre d' might gesture toward a table at a fancy restaurant. "The floor is yours," he said. There was the tiniest hint of amusement in his voice, so subtle that maybe only Priya caught it. He was already thinking about how he'd tell this story later to his colleagues over drinks. The time a 12-year-old tried to solve an impossible math problem at his symposium. It would make for a good anecdote. But Priya wasn't thinking about any of that. She was already moving toward the laptop, setting her worn notebook down beside it. The laptop was one of those expensive ones, probably belonged to the museum. When she touched the keyboard, she half expected someone to stop her. But no one did. Everyone was too curious, too invested now in seeing where this train wreck was headed. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a bright yellow sticky note. The page was covered in her handwriting, neat but small, with diagrams and arrows connecting different concepts. To anyone else, it probably looked like chaos. But to Priya, it was a map. A map she'd been drawing for 2 years, leading to this exact moment. Her fingers found the keyboard and she started typing. Not slowly or hesitantly, but with the speed of someone who'd spent countless hours coding. Someone for whom Python and JavaScript were as natural as speaking English. The audience couldn't see what she was typing yet. The screen was still dark to them, only visible on the laptop monitor in front of her. "The mistake most approaches make," Priya said, her voice finding its rhythm now that she was focused on the math instead of the crowd, "is treating this like you need to calculate everything by brute force. Like you have to check every single number, every single possibility. But that's not how patterns work." She pulled up a blank coding window and began writing a program, her fingers flying across the keys. If you look at prime number distributions as network nodes instead of just numbers in a line, something interesting happens. Behind her, Professor Thornton uncrossed his arms. He took a step closer to see what she was doing. His expression was changing, the patronizing smile fading into something more focused, more alert. "See, I was thinking about this like a game," Priya continued, still typing. "In video games, you don't render everything in the entire world all at once. That would crash your computer. You only render what the player can see, and you use something called culling to eliminate everything that doesn't matter to the current moment." She hit enter, and lines of code began scrolling across the screen. What if you could do the same thing with prime numbers? What if you could identify which branches of the calculation tree don't matter and just cut them out? Now the audience could see what Priya was doing. The laptop screen was being projected onto the massive display behind her, and her code was visible to everyone in the auditorium. Lines of Python script rolled across the screen as she typed, and for anyone who knew programming, it was immediately clear that this wasn't some child's toy project. This was actual functional code. Several people in the front rows leaned forward so far they were practically out of their seats. A woman with silver hair and glasses that hung on a chain around her neck squinted at the screen, then pulled out her own laptop and started typing furiously, probably trying to follow along with what Priya was building. Professor Thornton was now standing directly behind Priya, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. His eyes were locked on the screen, scanning each line of code as it appeared. The amused skepticism had completely vanished from his face. In its place was something else, concentration, maybe even a hint of concern. "What you're doing there," he said, his voice sharp and focused now, without any of the earlier condescension. "That's a graph theory implementation." "Yes," Priya said simply, not stopping her typing. "Combined with machine learning principles for pattern recognition. I taught myself from online courses. MIT has these free classes on their website, did you know that? And there's this YouTube channel run by a professor in California who explains neural networks in a way that actually makes sense." Someone in the audience laughed, not mockingly, but in genuine surprise and delight. The sound broke some of the tension in the room. Priya continued building her program, explaining as she went. So here's what I did. Instead of looking at prime numbers as just a sequence of one number after another, I mapped them into a three-dimensional space. Like coordinates on a grid, X, Y, and Z axes. And when you do that, when you give them spatial relationships instead of just linear ones, you start to see these clusters. She pulled up a visualization she'd pre-built, and the screen exploded into color. What had been dry numbers and equations suddenly became a three-dimensional scatterplot, with points of light floating in digital space like stars. Red dots represented prime numbers, blue dots represented composite numbers, and the way they organized themselves in three-dimensional space created visible patterns that didn't exist in traditional two-dimensional number lines. The auditorium gasped. Literally gasped. It was the kind of sound a crowd makes when a magician pulls off an impressive trick. Except this wasn't a trick. This was mathematics, naked and beautiful and completely unexpected. Do you see it? Priya asked, zooming in on a cluster of red dots. These prime numbers here and these over here, they're forming a structure. It's not random. There's a repeating pattern in how they relate to each other spatially, and once you identify the pattern in one section, you can predict where it's going to show up in other sections without having to calculate each individual number. A man in the third row stood up so fast he knocked his program booklet onto the floor. That's a self-similar fractal structure. You're saying prime number distribution exhibits fractal properties? Priya turned to look at him and shrugged. I mean, I don't know all the official terminology. But yeah, kind of. It's like how a fern leaf looks the same whether you zoom in or zoom out. The pattern repeats at different scales. Prime numbers do something similar when you map them this way. Professor Thornton's hand was on his chin now, his fingers pressing against his lips in a gesture of deep thought. He was staring at the visualization with the intensity of someone trying to find a flaw, trying to spot where the logic broke down, but he wasn't finding it. Show me the algorithm, he said abruptly. It wasn't a request. The actual computational part. How are you using this pattern recognition to reduce the calculation load? Priya minimized the visualization and pulled up another section of her code. Okay, so this is the part I'm most proud of. Once you've identified the self-similar structures, you can create what I call template zones. Basically, you calculate one zone fully, and then you use that as a template for other zones that follow the same pattern. You're not doing the full calculation every time. You're applying the known solution to similar situations. She scrolled through the code, explaining each section. It wasn't simple by any stretch. She used advanced concepts from multiple fields: number theory, machine learning, graph theory, computational optimization. But the way she explained it made it accessible. She broke down complex ideas into understandable chunks, using analogies and plain language that made even the non-mathematicians in the room nod along. The really cool part, Priya continued, her excitement building as she got deeper into her explanation, is that the more numbers you process, the better the algorithm gets at identifying templates. It's like it learns. So the first 1,000 prime numbers might take a while to process, but by the time you're at the 100,000th prime number, the algorithm is flying because it's recognized so many patterns. Professor Thornton's hand dropped from his chin. He took a step back, and Priya heard him mutter something under his breath that sounded like impossible, but in a very different tone than when he'd said it during his presentation. A woman's voice called out from the audience. Can you run it? Can you demonstrate it actually working? There was challenge in her voice, but also hope. The hope of someone who wanted to believe this was real but was afraid to be disappointed. Priya's fingers hovered over the keyboard. This was the moment. This was what she'd been building toward for 2 years. She'd run this program hundreds of times on her old laptop at home, on problems she'd created herself. She'd tested it, debugged it, refined it until it hummed like a well-oiled machine. But this was different. This was doing it in front of hundreds of people, including some of the smartest mathematicians in the country. If it failed now, if there was a bug she'd missed, or if it didn't work on this museum's laptop, what problem do you want me to solve? Priya asked, turning to look at Professor Thornton. He stared at her for a long moment, and something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement that they were past the point of dismissal, past the point of condescension. This had become real. Use the subset from my presentation, he said quietly. The one I said would take current supercomputers an infeasible amount of time to process. Priya nodded. She pulled up Professor Thornton's original problem set from his presentation file, which was still open on the laptop. It was a nasty piece of work, a prime sequence problem that required finding relationships between numbers in the hundreds of billions, the kind of thing that would make even powerful computers churn for hours, maybe days. She copied the parameters into her program, double-checked her settings, and then looked out at the audience. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, every single one of them waiting, holding their breath. "Okay," she said. "Here goes." She hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. The screen showed a loading bar that began to fill, pixel by pixel. The auditorium was so quiet that Priya could hear the laptop's fan spinning up as the processor kicked into high gear. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The loading bar crept forward. 20%. 30%. Someone in the audience coughed and it sounded like a thunderclap. 50%. 60%. Professor Thornton was staring at the screen like he was trying to will it to fail, to prove that this was all some elaborate mistake or fluke. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out. 80%, 90%, and then the screen flashed. Numbers appeared. A complete solution set, with prime relationships mapped, patterns identified, calculations completed. At the bottom of the screen, a small line of text displayed the elapsed time, 4.7 seconds. The auditorium exploded. People leapt from their seats. A man in the back actually yelled, "What?" loud enough to echo off the walls. The woman with the silver hair was shaking her head back and forth, her hands covering her mouth. Students were frantically photographing the screen with their phones. Two professors in the front row were having an animated argument, pointing at the display and gesticulating wildly. Professor Thornton just stood there, frozen, staring at the results. His face had gone pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the chaos. That's not possible," but Priya heard him. She turned to face him, and for the first time since she'd walked onto this stage, she smiled. A real, genuine smile, not smug or boastful, but filled with the pure joy of someone who'd been told something was impossible and had proved otherwise. "It is possible," she said. "It's right there." People were rushing toward the stage now. Security guards moved to intercept them, but the museum director waved them off. This wasn't a security situation. This was history happening in real time, and she was smart enough to recognize it. A man with wild curly hair and a MIT lanyard around his neck reached the stage first. "Can you send me that code? I need to verify this independently. I need to run this through our lab systems. I need to see the source code," someone else called out. "All of it. Every line. Has this been peer-reviewed?" a woman demanded. "Has anyone else validated these results?" Professor Thornton held up his hands, and something in his gesture, maybe the authority he carried, maybe just the desperate need for order, made people quiet down enough to hear him. His hands were shaking, actually physically shaking. "Everyone, please." His voice cracked slightly. I need to verify this, independently, right now." Professor Thornton pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. The confident academic who had stood on this stage less than an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they'd just watched their entire understanding of the universe shift on its axis. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb moving fast, almost frantic. "I'm calling Jennifer Wu at MIT, he announced to no one in particular. "And David Chen and—" He kept scrolling. "God, I need at least 3 independent verifications, maybe 5. The audience had quieted somewhat, but the energy in the room was electric. People were still on their feet, still talking in excited clusters. But there was an underlying current of tension now. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just about one problem being solved. If this 12-year-old girl had actually done what she appeared to have done, if her algorithm actually worked the way it seemed to work, then decades of assumptions about computational mathematics were wrong. Entire research careers had been built on the idea that certain problems were fundamentally unsolvable with current methods. Priya stood on the stage, suddenly unsure what to do with herself. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a strange floating feeling. Her father had made it to the front of the auditorium and was being stopped by a security guard who looked extremely confused about whether he should be enforcing rules or just letting this chaos unfold. "That's my dad," Priya called out, pointing. "Can he come up here?" The museum director, A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun, nodded at the security guard. Let him through. Let the family through. Raj practically ran up the stage steps with Dev close behind. When he reached Priya, he pulled her into a hug so tight she could barely breathe. I can't believe you just did that, he whispered into her hair. I can't believe you've been working on this and you never told me how far you'd gotten. You would have worried, Priya said, her voice muffled against his shirt. I'm worrying now. But he was laughing as he said it, that slightly hysterical laugh of someone whose stress has nowhere else to go. Professor Thornton had his phone on speaker now, pacing back and forth across the stage. The voice of a woman came through, tinny but clear. Richard? What's so urgent? I'm in the middle of... Jennifer, I need you to run a verification for me. Right now. I'm sending you a problem set and an algorithm. Drop everything and run it. There was a pause. What are you talking about? What algorithm? Just do it, please. I'll explain everything, but I need you to confirm something for me. I need to know if I'm losing my mind. While Professor Thornton made his calls, the woman with the silver hair approached the stage. Up close, Priya could see her name tag. Dr. Helen Vasquez, it read, from Berkeley. She looked at Priya with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite disbelief, not quite wonder. Something in between. How old are you, sweetheart? Dr. Vasquez asked. 12. Well, 12 and a half. Dr. Vasquez shook her head slowly. 12 and a half. Lord have mercy. Can I ask you something? Priya nodded. Where did you learn to code like that? That wasn't beginner programming. That was sophisticated software engineering. Online, mostly, Priya said. YouTube tutorials. Those free MIT courses I mentioned. My dad taught me some basics when I was little, but then I kind of just kept going on my own. There's so much free stuff online if you know where to look. In the mathematics? The number theory? The graph theory? The machine learning concepts? Priya shrugged. Library books. Online papers. Some of it I didn't fully understand at first, so I'd read it multiple times until it clicked. Sometimes I'd email professors, just random ones at universities, asking questions. Some of them never wrote back, but some of them did. There was this really nice professor at Stanford who answered like 15 of my emails about computational complexity. Dr. Vasquez looked like she was going to cry. 15 emails from a child about computational complexity, and someone at Stanford actually responded. Yeah, Professor Kim, she was super helpful. I should probably email her about tonight. The chaos on stage continued for the next 20 minutes. Professor Thornton had now called 5 different colleagues at various universities. He'd sent Priya's code and the problem set to all of them, marking the emails as urgent, triple-checking that the files had gone through. Then came the waiting. The museum director had asked if people wanted to take a break, maybe get coffee from the cafe downstairs, but nobody moved. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. This was like watching a rocket launch, the kind of moment where you needed to be able to say, I was there for the rest of your life. Priya sat down on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling off the side. Her notebook sat next to her, still open to her scribbled notes and diagrams. Dev sat next to her, looking at her like he'd never seen her before. How long have you been working on this? He asked quietly. 2 years, maybe? I kinda lost track. 2 years. You've been working on this for 2 years and you never said anything? Priya picked at a thread on her jeans. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't want anyone to tell me I was wasting my time. You know how it is. Everyone always wants to tell kids what's realistic and what's not. Dev bumped his shoulder against hers. Well, I guess you just redefined realistic. The first call came back after 16 minutes. Professor Thornton's phone rang and he answered it so fast he nearly dropped it. Jennifer? What did you find? The woman's voice came through the speaker and she sounded shaken. Richard, where did you get this algorithm? Just tell me. Does it work? Yes, it works. It shouldn't work. The approach is completely unconventional. It violates several assumptions I would have sworn were fundamental to computational number theory. But it works. We ran it 3 times on 3 different problem sets. Same results. Fast, accurate, and somehow using a fraction of the computational resources that should be required. Professor Thornton closed his eyes. Okay, thank you. Richard, where did this come from? He opened his eyes and looked at Priya. This small 12-year-old girl sitting on the stage with her beat-up notebook and her worn-out sneakers. I'll explain later, he said. I have other calls coming in. The next verification came back 4 minutes after that, then another, then 2 more almost simultaneously. All of them said the same thing. The algorithm worked. It was real. It was revolutionary. By the time the 5th and final verification call came through, Professor Thornton had stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the stage, phone in hand, and just listened as a professor from Yale confirmed what everyone now knew. When the call ended, he lowered his phone slowly and looked out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice hoarse, "I owe you all an apology. Earlier tonight I told you that this problem was impossible to solve. I was wrong." The audience erupted in applause, but Professor Thornton held up his hand. "More importantly," he continued, "I owe a very specific apology to someone who had the courage to challenge my assumptions." He turned to face Priya. "Would you stand up, please?" Priya stood, suddenly nervous again despite everything that had just happened. Professor Thornton walked over to her and extended his hand. Not in the casual way adults do when they're humoring a child, but with genuine respect, with humility. "Priya," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "I am sorry. I'm sorry for doubting you. I'm sorry for the condescending way I responded to your question. And I'm sorry that people like me have probably made you feel like you had to prove yourself before anyone would take you seriously." He paused, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "What you've done here tonight is remarkable. No, it's more than remarkable. It's genuinely groundbreaking. This algorithm, this approach, this way of thinking about a problem that has stumped the mathematical community for decades. You've opened a door that many of us thought was permanently closed." The applause started again, but this time Professor Thornton didn't stop it. He just stood there shaking Priya's hand, while hundreds of people rose to their feet. This wasn't polite applause. This wasn't the kind of clapping you do because it's expected. This was genuine, overwhelming recognition from people who understood exactly what they had witnessed. Priya shook his hand, and when their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that made her throat tight. It was respect, yes, but also something else. Maybe a little bit of grief for assumptions he'd held onto for too long. Maybe a little bit of excitement for what this meant for his field. Maybe just the exhaustion of having your entire worldview challenged in the space of an hour. "Thank you," she said simply. "No," Professor Thornton replied, and a smile finally broke through his shock. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up when I tried to dismiss you. Thank you for having the courage to come up here. Thank you for proving that impossible is just another word for, we haven't figured it out yet." He released her hand and turned to address the audience again. "I know there are questions, so many questions, about the algorithm, about the mathematics, about what this means for ongoing research in this field. But those questions can wait until tomorrow. Right now, I have a more important question." He looked back at Priya. "Would you be willing to publish this work? With proper guidance and support, of course. You deserve credit for this discovery. Your name should be on this research and—" He hesitated, seeming almost nervous now. "Would you consider working with my research team? We could learn so much from each other. I could provide resources, access to equipment, connections to other researchers in the field, and you could teach us how to look at problems the way you do, without all the assumptions that come from years of traditional training." The auditorium had gone quiet again, everyone waiting for Priya's answer. She looked at her father, who had tears streaming down his face and was nodding encouragingly. She looked at her brother, who was grinning like an idiot. She looked at Dr. Vasquez, who mouthed, "Say yes." She looked out at the sea of faces, all these brilliant people who had come here tonight expecting one thing and had gotten something completely different. Then she looked back at Professor Thornton and smiled. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The video hit the internet before Priya even made it home that night. Someone in the audience had been recording on their phone, and by the time the Patel family's car pulled into their driveway in the suburbs, the footage was already spreading like wildfire across social media. Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, everywhere you looked. People were sharing the clip of a 12-year-old girl solving what a Harvard professor had called an impossible problem. By morning, it had gone viral in the truest sense of the word. Millions of views, thousands of comments, news outlets picking up the story. 12-year-old math prodigy stuns, Harvard professor. Girl genius solves impossible math problem. The future of mathematics has pigtails in a backpack. Priya woke up to her phone buzzing non-stop with notifications. Her Instagram, which had maybe 50 followers yesterday, mostly cousins and kids from school, now had thousands of follow requests. Her email inbox was completely overwhelmed. Messages from reporters from universities, from people she'd never heard of congratulating her or asking questions or wanting interviews. "Mom," she called downstairs, staring at her phone in disbelief. "I think something weird is happening." Her mother, Anjali, appeared in her doorway holding her own phone with a slightly panicked expression. "Priya, honey, there are news vans outside our house. Multiple news vans. What do we do?" The next few days were a complete whirlwind. The family had to unplug their doorbell because reporters kept ringing it. Priya's school principal called to ask if she needed time off to deal with the attention. Professor Thornton called 3 times a day with updates, universities wanting to meet her, research institutions offering resources, tech companies asking if she'd consider internships when she was older. But the real impact of what happened that night at the museum went far deeper than just viral fame. Within the academic community, Priya's algorithm sparked immediate and intense interest. Professor Thornton, true to his word, helped her prepare a formal paper for publication. They worked together over video calls, Priya explaining her methodology while Professor Thornton helped translate her intuitive understanding into the formal language of academic mathematics. The SAI paper was published 6 months later in one of the most prestigious mathematical journals in the world. The title read, "A Novel Approach to Prime Number Sequence. Prediction Using Spatial Mapping and Pattern Recognition, the Patel-Thornton Algorithm." Professor Thornton had insisted on putting her name first. "You did the work," he'd told her firmly. "I just helped you explain it to people who needed the explanation. That paper changed things, not just for Priya but for the entire field." Other mathematicians began applying her spatial mapping approach to different problems. Computer scientists found ways to implement her pattern recognition techniques in artificial intelligence systems. Cryptography experts realized her work had massive implications for data security. Problems that had seemed insurmountable suddenly had new paths forward. But beyond the academic impact, Priya's story sparked something else entirely. She became, almost overnight, a symbol, proof that genius doesn't wait for permission, proof that being young or being underestimated doesn't mean you're wrong. Proof that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from people who don't know enough to understand that something is supposed to be impossible. Schools across the country began reaching out, asking if Priya would speak to their students. At first, Anjali was protective and said no to most requests. "You're 12, she kept saying. "You still need to be a kid." But Priya wanted to do some of them, especially when she started getting letters from young girls, many of them from underrepresented communities, telling her that seeing her success made them believe they could pursue math and science too. So she started saying yes, carefully and selectively. She spoke at her own school first, standing in front of an assembly of kids who used to ignore her in the hallways. She told them about the nights she'd stayed up late working on her algorithm, the times she'd wanted to quit, the moments she'd doubted herself. "The thing is," she said to a gym full of middle schoolers who were actually paying attention, "everybody kept telling me I was too young to understand this stuff, that I should wait until college or focus on normal homework, or just accept that some people are naturally good at math and some aren't. But none of that is true." She clicked to a slide showing her bedroom wall covered in string and pushpins, the prime number map that had started everything. Several kids laughed at how chaotic it looked. "I know it looks crazy," Priya said with a grin. "My mom kept asking me to take it down. But here's what I learned. Sometimes being crazy, being obsessed with something that other people don't care about, being willing to look stupid because you're trying something new, sometimes that's exactly what you need to do." After that assembly, 3 kids came up to her with notebooks full of their own projects. A 7th grader who was trying to design a better water filtration system, a 6th grader who was teaching herself quantum physics, an 8th grader who was writing an algorithm to help predict traffic patterns. Priya looked at their work, remembered what it felt like to have adults dismiss her enthusiasm, and made time to talk with each of them seriously. Professor Thornton, meanwhile, was undergoing his own transformation. The experience with Priya had shaken something loose in him. He started advocating loudly for changes in how universities approached education and research. He wrote op-eds arguing for more inclusion of young people in academic symposiums. He pushed for mentorship programs that connected established researchers with talented youth. regardless of their background or traditional credentials. "We've been gatekeeping brilliance," he said in an interview with a major science magazine. "We've set up all these arbitrary rules about who gets to participate in academic discourse, and we're missing out on incredible minds because they don't fit our narrow definition of what a researcher looks like." He also became personally invested in making sure Priya had the support she needed. He connected her with other young mathematicians, helped her apply to special summer programs, made sure she had access to computational resources for her ongoing work. But he was careful never to push too hard, always deferring to her and her family about what felt right. "She's not a performing monkey." He snapped at a TV producer who wanted to film Priya solving math problems on camera for entertainment. "She's a brilliant young researcher who deserves respect and space to grow. If you can't approach this story with that understanding, find someone else to interview." The partnership between them became something neither had expected. Professor Thornton brought academic rigor, professional connections, and the weight of institutional support. Priya brought fresh perspectives, fearless questioning, and a willingness to challenge conventional thinking. Together, they co-authored 3 more papers over the next year, each one exploring new applications of her original insights. The attention eventually died down, as viral stories always do. The news vans left. The interview requests became less frequent. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal now included Priya regularly, consulting with PhD candidates 3 times, her age and Professor Thornton flying across the country to have brainstorming sessions with a middle schooler. 2 years after that night at the museum, when Priya was 14, MIT offered her a full scholarship, not as a publicity stunt or a way to claim they had a child prodigy, but as a genuine recognition that she was ready for advanced study, that she could contribute meaningfully to their research community, and that she had earned her place there through her work. The decision about whether to accept was harder than anything Priya had solved mathematically. She was only 14. Taking the scholarship meant leaving regular high school, leaving her friends, leaving the normal teenage experience she'd barely gotten to have. But it also meant access to resources, collaboration with researchers working on cutting-edge problems, and the chance to keep learning at the pace her mind demanded. She talked about it with her parents for weeks. Anjali worried about her daughter missing out on school dances and football games, and all the normal things teenagers do. Raj worried about the pressure, about putting too much on her shoulders too soon. Dev, now in college himself, had mixed feelings but ultimately told her, "You're going to do something amazing whether you go or not. The question is just where you want to do it." Professor Thornton, when she asked his advice, was thoughtful. "I can't tell you what to do," he said. "But I can tell you this.